Subcommittee will come to order. Welcome to the first Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Subcommittee hearing of 2019. Today we'll be conducting oversight of HUD's management during the recent government shutdown with a focus on nearly 1,200 expired housing contracts that put tens of thousands of tenants at risk. I'm pleased to have Brian Montgomery, the Acting Deputy Secretary of HUD, and Irv Dennis, the department's Chief Financial Officer, here to testify this afternoon. Thank you for being here. We look forward to your testimony. Before I make a brief opening statement about the subject matter of the hearing, I do want to say how pleased I am that Mr. Diaz-Balart and I will again be working as partners in running this subcommittee, more or less, doing the best we can in a cooperative fashion, and that was the way it was when Mr. Diaz-Balart was chairman, and I certainly intend to operate in the same way. We plan to be collegial and cooperative to work through our differences and to produce a good fiscal 2020 HUD bill that will garner strong bipartisan support. I also want to introduce the new subcommittee members on the Democratic side of the dais. Representative Bonnie Watson-Coleman of New Jersey, Representative Norma Torres of California, and still to come, Representative Brenda Lawrence of Michigan. These are great new members. They're going to bring valuable perspectives to the subcommittee, and we're excited to have them join our returning members on Team T-HUD, we'll call it. Now let's return to the business before us this afternoon. The recent presidentially induced government shutdown, which lasted 35 days, was one of the worst blunders in American political history. Probably wouldn't get much disagreement on that. It was self-inflicted, damaging, and counterproductive. I don't believe anybody in this room wanted it. Unfortunately, the president did, and it took more than a month before he allowed even a temporary solution to be put in place. Unfortunately, HUD was a major casualty of the president's recklessness. Shutdowns hinder or halt essential government functions, and agencies like HUD are left with a skeleton staff to cope with the fallout. And every indication is that this time the damage was especially severe. Serious questions have emerged about the department's management of the lapse in appropriations, including the degree to which the shutdown was anticipated and whether adequate preparations were made in the weeks that preceded it. Many housing contracts were allowed to expire, putting tens of thousands of tenants at risk in the project-based rental assistance program and the 202 and 811 housing programs for the elderly and disabled, respectively. Approximately 650 of these contracts expired in December, many of them before the lapse in appropriations occurred. The shutdown then greatly complicated the task of curtailing the damage. That is unacceptable. The department should have seen this coming, but senior leadership failed to take necessary action. HUD's options were further limited by the fact that the department had imprudently spent approximately $400 million in advance appropriations at the beginning of the fiscal year. Now, this money's flexible. It's designed to accommodate housing contracts since they operate on a calendar year basis rather than a federal fiscal year. HUD could have used the advance appropriations during the shutdown to renew expiring contracts, but the money had already been spent. Compounding the problem was the department's haphazard communication with stakeholders, including tenants, housing providers, and I have to say, the Congress. HUD expected landlords and nonprofit groups to tap into their funding reserves, their own reserves, to keep contracts afloat, but the department failed to issue timely instructions. We heard numerous reports from landlords who had not received guidance. Meanwhile, this subcommittee got wind of the difficulties and requested basic information from the department about the number of expiring contracts and affected properties. HUD had already shared this information with outside stakeholders, but refused to provide Congress with the same information for nearly a week, despite frequent inquiries. So this, too, is unacceptable. This Appropriations Committee expects HUD to comply with legitimate oversight requests And I hope we will receive assurances from our witnesses today that this kind of episode won't be repeated. We need a better understanding of what went wrong and why it went wrong. Just as important, we need to know what HUD is doing to ensure similar problems don't recur. The subcommittee is prepared to be a partner with HUD. If there are certain adjustments in the way the department's funding is working, we need to know that. We want to be helpful. But we also need for HUD to provide an honest assessment of what happened and how it can improve. So again, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this afternoon. I'd like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Diaz-Balart, for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I again, first would like to start to also welcome the new members of the subcommittees. Mr. Chairman, you already mentioned the new Democrats, and we are joined by, I think, among the best members that Congress has, Mr. Womack, Mr. Rutherford, and Mr. Hurd. They are, frankly, I'm thrilled that you are part of this subcommittee, Mr. Chairman. You will find them to be, frankly, phenomenal members of this committee. I may be a little biased, but I really think that this subcommittee plays a significant, significant role to our nation, and so I'm thrilled to be on the subcommittee with all of you. Now, let me start by first congratulating you, Mr. Chairman, for your chairmanship. Don't get me wrong, I liked it when you were ranking member better. But on a serious note, look, I've had the privilege to serve on the subcommittee with Mr. Price for 4 years now, and he is fair. It's been a partnership, and we not only have gotten to, I think, work and like each other, but trust each other, and that's the most important thing. And I've also gained a special appreciation for the chairman, for his dedication to not only public service, but frankly, Mr. Chairman, your deep understanding of the individual and sometimes very complex programs of the jurisdiction of your subcommittee. So I look forward to continue working with you again, and not only working with you, but collaborating with you. And we're gonna have a good time together, Mr. Chairman. And just a note: a lot of the times it's in essence, chairman versus ranking member in the negotiations. So that's not been our experience. It has been House negotiating as one in this subcommittee to deal with the important issues. And so again, I look forward to continue working with Mr. Chairman. And congratulations. I want to welcome our witnesses today. Acting Deputy Secretary Montgomery. You stepped into your role again, second in command at HUD 4 weeks into the shutdown, and in difficult times. That was not an easy assignment, but I know you took on this role with, again, deep understanding of HUD's mission and operations. And you also serve as Assistant Secretary for Housing and FHA Commissioner, so you are serving double duty, managing the day-to-day operations of HUD while overseeing a $1 trillion housing portfolio, something that a lot of us obviously care deeply about. So that's quite a responsibility, sir, and thank you for what you're doing in your service. And Mr. Dennis, I know you had an entire career in the private sector before you came to serve here at HUD as CFO. Thank you for agreeing to do that. I appreciate that you combine, again, private sector, a private sector perspective, which is so helpful, with a commitment to HUD's mission and its workforce. Thank you both for your service. I look forward to hearing about how you dealt with this extremely challenging time and keeping HUD programs running across the country as best as you possibly could during the shutdown. I would also like to thank the professional staff at HUD who were called to duty during the shutdown. And again, I don't think staff gets enough credit. Even as they missed 2 paychecks, they worked to make sure that programs across the country continued to serve the neediest among us. Your efforts and theirs, gentlemen, ensured that no tenants were evicted during the 35-day shutdown. We have an opportunity today to look at lessons learned from, again, this experience and explore how to move forward and improve HUD systems and processes. Chairman Price and I share the goal of helping HUD meet its mission to serve our most vulnerable citizens, including the elderly, the disabled, and our heroes, our veterans. So I hope today's hearing will be the beginning of a conversation with you and other senior leaders at HUD on how to best do that. And so I look forward to our dialogue today. I thank the chairman. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, and we'll now turn to the statement from our witnesses. Mr. Montgomery, I understand you have a full written statement for the record. We'll include that. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Price, Ranking Member Diaz-Balart, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for welcoming me today to discuss the most recent lapse in appropriations and how HUD performed during this weeks-long interruption to our normal operations. And to those new members of the subcommittee, I'd like to say welcome. Secretary Carson, the rest of HUD's senior leadership team looks forward to working with you. I am pleased to be joined today by our Chief Financial Officer, Irv Dennis. Irv came to HUD in January of 2018 after considerable private sector experience. With 37 years of accounting and audit work under his belt, ultimately as a partner of the global firm of Ernst & Young, Irv brings a vast well of knowledge to HUD as we seek to improve the agency's financial management and accounting practices. In short, to be better stewards of the taxpayer dollars. Today, I'd like to offer you a brief summary of HUD's operations during the most recent government shutdown. I am proud to report that, that despite the furlough of close to 97% of our dedicated workforce, HUD continued to support activities that impact the health and safety of the individuals and families that we serve. For example, we continued to make payments to 3,200 public housing authorities during the shutdown. We continue to make contract payments to private owners participating in our project-based rental assistance program. And we continued to renew expiring Section 8 contracts during the shutdown. In cases where payments could not be made, our team worked with owners to find interim solutions, such as accessing property reserves, in order to ensure that residents were not impacted. We understood the vulnerability of those families who were concerned that, through no fault of their own, they would be at risk because of expired contracts. And in contrast to some of the predictions you may have read in the media, there were no evictions of our residents and any of our properties as a result of the shutdown. Zero. On the single-family side, we continue to make certain families could secure FHA-insured mortgages so that they could purchase a home or refinance an existing mortgage. In the area of disaster recovery, while our ability to review pending long-term disaster recovery actions plans was suspended during the shutdown, we took the necessary steps to ensure that Puerto Rico could access the obligated $1.5 billion in Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery funds for which an action plan had already been approved. We continued and are continuing to provide needed technical assistance to our grantees in the development and execution of the recovery programs. I can assure this subcommittee that the shutdown did not materially alter the long-term recovery of our grantees. Specifically, in the case of Puerto Rico, we moved heaven and earth to make sure the financial systems were in place to allow the Commonwealth to draw upon their already approved funds. In fact, just last week, Secretary Carson and I met with Governor Ricardo Rosselló to confirm that HUD's work during the shutdown allowed Puerto Rico to proceed with its initial draw as early as February the 4th, 2019. I'm pleased to announce this occurred on February the 8th. Again, we did what needed to be done. Finally, we were in daily contact with your staff to make certain we were as transparent as could be during a very difficult period. And we accomplished this all with just 3 to 5% of our staff, using IT systems that are in desperate need of modernization. HUD employees from multiple program offices, none of them being paid during the shutdown, moved mountains to make sure that our critical and legally permissible activities continued to function, even if most of our agency could not. Irv's team and the Office of the Chief Financial Officer played a role that cannot be overstated, which is one of the many reasons I'm pleased to appear with him today. We can all be immensely proud of their public service. Again, thank you for the opportunity to tell the story before this subcommittee. Irv and I will be pleased to answer any of your questions.
Thank you. Let me, before we start the questioning, just say that we plan to continue the ground rules that have been in effect on this subcommittee for some time. We will have 5-minute segments for questions and answers. the standard 5-minute rounds. We will alternate sides between the parties. We will recognize members in order of seniority as they were seated at the beginning of the hearing. And then those who come in after the beginning will be recognized later. We ask all members to be mindful of your time. It's not 5 minutes for the question and then the answer is another 5. The idea is to have the question and the answer both within the 5-minute period, so you need to allow our witnesses time to answer within your 5-minute turn. If there are no questions about that, we are familiar with the procedure, and I'll go ahead with the first question. We of course faced a huge challenge, as everyone acknowledges, when it organized on January 3rd. In fact, as soon as was possible that very day, we passed legislation on the floor of the House to reopen the government, and we knew the harm that a shutdown can cause and was already causing. The effects are widespread. We anticipated that there would be severe consequences for many, many federal agencies and the people they serve, including this agency, HUD. And there was a risk of people being evicted. Thankfully, they were not evicted, as Mr. Montgomery just said, but we came very close. It was a real possibility, and that is a shocking realization and one that's at the heart of our inquiry today. So let me ask you, Mr. Montgomery, and Mr. Dennis chimes in as needed. When did you know there was a problem with the renewal of expiring multifamily contracts? That is, that there could be a problem with respect to not only a shutdown but a CR. When did you realize that this could pose a problem and you would need to deal with it well in advance?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to pull back the curtain a little, we have contracts expiring every day. Contracts are expiring as we sit in this room today. We have 23,000 of them. We renew them on an ongoing basis. I would add it's a very paper-centric process using antiquated technology, largely driven by wet signatures on paper documents. So it's a very time-consuming process we hope to fix through some upgrades in technology that are long overdue. We began preparing for this shutdown, again, not knowing if it would ever occur, much less how long it would happen, weeks, if not months before it happened.
How far? How many weeks or months? That's what I'm asking.
Mr. Chairman, I know we had some discussions in November. You know, we frequently assess things, including shutdown plans. Thankfully, the last one was 5 years ago. And when, by and large, that was the blueprint, that contingency plan developed during the previous administration. But again, you never really know a shutdown happens until it happens.
There's a 4-month notice, is that right? A 4-month notice period? So would you not have known for the contracts expiring at the end of the year, let's say, would you not have known or had the notice period begin in September?
Well, again, the contracts expire on an ongoing basis. The overwhelming of them, sir, out of the 23,000 contracts, almost 21,500 of them were paid up through February, over 94% of them. The percentage of contracts that expired in December was about 550. We had another 500 or so expiring in January. Again, we typically, since that process happens all through the month, we many times spend the next couple of weeks of the following month getting caught up on the previous month. Again, largely due because of the antiquated process that is currently used.
So in September, though, it's September. That's the 4-month advance notice date, right?
Well, sir, but again, we didn't know in September that there was going to be a shutdown.
Well, that's the part of my question. You had some pretty good clues, didn't you, that there would at least be a CR?
Well, sir, I would say there have been a lot of CRs, and it's a difficult
All the more
place to
reason
be
to
in to administer an
All the more reason
agency.
to anticipate. I mean, we worked on we had a very good bill ready to go in September. I firmly believe if we had been here one more week before we adjourned to go campaign, we would have had that bill on deck, ready for the new fiscal year. But we didn't, and we certainly never doubted that the bill was in jeopardy. I'm asking, could you not anticipate in September that there might be a problem with these December contracts?
Well, sir, I'll reiterate that every month we have contracts expire. We typically spend into the next month to get caught up, which is what we did here, even during a shutdown, which, by the way, we never renewed contracts during any government shutdown. We're told by our long-term HUD staff that it never happened, despite the fact that they had expired in previous shutdowns.
All the more reason to anticipate a shutdown is coming and get as much of this cleared up as you possibly can in terms of
Yes, sir. No objection, sir.
All right, and so how long did it take you to get a handle on the magnitude of this problem? Our staff were informed that HUD might have failed to review 1,150 multifamily housing contracts on January 4th and received confirmation of that from HUD. On January 9th, Ms. Montgomery, I think you participated in a call with stakeholders where you provided additional details about the renewal problems. Those stakeholders then reached out to committee staff with this information. Our staff then called HUD to confirm these details and were told that HUD could not confirm it, but that the information was, quote, probably accurate. Surely you can see why that would be frustrating.
And,
It's
sir,
concerning we wouldn't hear about this, or that we would hear about an issue this important only after outside groups were told.
Well, sir, I'll apologize for any miscommunication. I'm fairly certain that Mr. Dennis's staff spoke with the committee staff on January the 4th. My first calls to housing advocates were the following week, I believe starting on January the 11th. I would say, could communication improve if there's a future shutdown? Absolutely. But, sir, I would just ask you to understand we had less than 3% of our staff trying to run an agency, and it was it's pretty long days for everybody.
We'll return to this. Mr. Diaz-Balart?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Montgomery, so we hear that there were approximately 1,200 contracts that expired during the shutdown. How many of those contracts were you able to ultimately get signed during the shutdown? Any idea?
Well, it's a lengthy process, and again, I just want to keep reiterating this point. It's an antiquated, slow process that is long overdue for modernization, and unfortunately, this episode pulled back the curtain on that. So again, we started renewing those contracts by recalling staff, something that had not been done during previous shutdowns. There was 550, another 650 or so in January. I'm pleased to report that as of today, all of them, all the ones for December and January have been authorized for renewal.
So you don't have any remaining that expired that are still expired today, as far as you know?
Well, and I just want to make sure I'm clear on the point that they've been authorized for renewal, which by and large means all that's left to be done is to execute a signature,
Right.
typically now by the owner. So the total of 1,175 for December, January, and February have now been authorized for renewal, and that actually happened yesterday.
That's great to hear, and that's an impressive number, by the way. In particular, again, we're talking about a shutdown situation, so that's amazing. Let me talk to you a little bit about during normal times, not shutdown times, as you run this program. I understand that, again, project-based elderly and disabled contracts, again, they can periodically expire. And so can you provide us with some of the reasons, normally, that you may not be able to immediately renew contracts that are on the verge of expiration or that have already been expired? I'm not talking about a shutdown situation. I'm talking about the regular order of business.
Well, again, we have some 23,000 contracts altogether. About 18,000 are project-based rental assistance. Another 5,000 are what we call PRAC renewals, which are essentially for Section 202 and 811, the elderly and persons with disabilities programs. There's different pots of money, sir, but regardless, they all require a contract. So as I mentioned before, that is a process that is ongoing, happens every day, all day. And again, it's very time-consuming, and we've been working with our CIO as a result of lessons learned during the shutdown to greatly modernize that process.
So during a shutdown, and again, to say you were understaffed during that time is an understatement, obviously. And can you walk us through the steps that HUD took to, for example, communicate with, the private owners whose contract had expired during the shutdown? How were you able to do that? Were you able to do that at all?
Well, as has been the practice in previous shutdowns, which thankfully they're not very frequently, we send out notices to owners. This time I have elected to personally call some housing stakeholders, some advocates. I thought that they should hear directly from me with an update. I didn't realize later that might be an issue, but again, I stand by what I did. So again, we typically don't face off directly to tenants. That's typically done through the landlords and through the property owners.
You talked a little, you mentioned a little bit in your opening statement that, that certain owners could borrow from their reserves, right? If their contracts had expired. Can you just very briefly kind of explain to me how that works?
Yes, sir. So owners are aware that they can, if they have to, pull down some of those what are called replacement for reserves. I suspect the ones we've talked with anticipated, that a shutdown was occurring there just days before it happened. But we officially put out a couple of notices, one on January the 4th and one on January the 9th, reaching out to property owners and advising them of the current situation.
And let me ask you then also, do you know how many staff did you have to recall to HUD headquarters and to the field to do the work of, again, dealing with all these issues?
So approximately 15 staff and headquarters are working on it. We ultimately recalled another total of 50 out in the field because, again, these contracts could have been in any number of places. In a field office, in our Fort Worth office, could have been with the owner, could have been with the headquarters staff.
I have to tell you that I'm super pleased to hear that you managed this shutdown, and it was a lengthy shutdown, without any evictions, obviously, which would have been horrendous, which I think says a lot to the skills and the ability and commitment of your team, frankly. And I'm running out of time, and if we get another round, I want to kind of touch a little bit about that, because that was obviously is a huge priority for this subcommittee, and obviously it was a huge priority for you. And again, that part, I think all of us have to say, job well done. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Montgomery, I'm new to this subcommittee, so I'm listening and learning. So I might ask you some very fundamental questions. Of the 1,250 or the 1,150 or the 1,200 contracts that were expired during the shutdown, were these contracts with owners of properties, and did these represent multiple tenants, or were these contracts per tenant, per owner?
So these are contracts basically per property with a combination of what we call project-based rental assistance, and then the Section 202 elderly program, and then the Section 811 program for persons with disabilities.
So the 1,200 or the 1,150?
1175.
1175 represents contracts which expired over the spectrum.
December and January.
But over different programs.
Yes, ma'am.
What
That's
is
correct.
811?
That is a program for housing for persons with disabilities.
Okay. And the 202 is for
the elderly.
For the elderly.
Yes, ma'am.
And so there are Section 8 housing programs for individuals that are renting an entire house, right?
Well, most of these are for multifamily properties that are owned by, the project-based are owned by private owners, unlike the traditional public housing.
Okay, and what about the public housing contracts? Were those affected here as well?
They have a different pot of money. They had access to more funds than we had. They were largely paid up through February during the shutdown.
When you talk about reserves, what kind of landlord are you talking about?
So it depends on the program. If the project has FHA insurance, they're required to have reserves. Those that don't, most of the owners keep reserves anyway for rainy day funds. And for 202 and 811, they're required to have reserves.
These are the rentals, all rentals we're talking
Yes,
about?
yes, Congresswoman, yes, they are.
All right. So you said that all of the contracts that had expired are brought up to date and only need a signature now?
The category is authorized for renewal, and right now we are, actually made a decision a couple of days ago to accept PDF signatures. We put our heads together and realize that we don't want to rely on not knowing what's going to happen Friday on U.S. mail or FedEx, so we're accepting PDF signatures.
So how long will it be before those people affected by those contracts actually see the money that they would have gotten over that period of shutdown?
Well, so we've already, 100% of them are authorized for renewal. About half of them actually have all the signatures. They should be receiving those funds imminently if they haven't already. And our goal is to wrap all this up by Friday so that, again, not knowing what's going to happen Friday, we can have them all buttoned up.
So during this shutdown, was there any, because I get the impression that everything went well from your presentation, and if that's so, that's great. But is there any situation over this shutdown where if you had the advance appropriations of $400 million unspent or some other pot of money, you would have actually had the occasion to use it then, during that shutdown?
Without passing judgment, I would just say it's difficult to administer a cabinet agency under continuing resolution after continuing resolution. The last one, we had all of 2 weeks to expend those funds, again, not knowing what was going to happen, whether or not there was going to be another shutdown. So that makes it very difficult, given we have 1,000 different allotments. We have, we have about 85 allotments and about 1,000 different accounts. And every time we have a CR, we have to do that process all over again. And Irv, you
Yeah,
might
it's
want to add something to that.
operating under a CR is extraordinarily difficult. The money that's appropriated on the first day of a CR is not available immediately for obligation. We have funds controls that go in place. It's really a 5-step process. There are 83 allotments. It finds itself down to 1,000 accounts, and through those 5 processes, there's multiple levels of review and control. And it could take up to 1.5 to 3 weeks for money to get from CR to obligation.
And I asked the question, just for clarification, the $400 million that's defined as advanced appropriations, what is that intended for?
So the advanced funds, and this gets to an issue that we've been focused on since I've been there and even prior, is the technology side of our business. The advanced funds are used to bridge us from one year to the next. So the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, due to our poor and antiquated technology, we shut down the systems for 2.5 weeks to close our prior year's books. Historically, these advanced funds are used to bridge that period. We do not use these advanced funds to anticipate a shutdown. They are pretty much used in the first quarter or first month or two. I would say during the CR, we had 2 weeks to take the appropriated money, go through the steps of obligation, and this is Christmas time, it's holiday time. We were very focused on making sure that January and February's funds were allocated so there wouldn't be any.
Mr. Dennis, I'm sorry. I'm brand new and my time long ago expired. I yield back. Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations, by the way. And I in a previous life, I served on this subcommittee. I'm back, so warning to everybody. To the gentleman today, thank you. I mean, from what I've heard, it's not like we didn't have a shutdown, because we did, but it seems to me, based on the discussion that's happened here today already, that HUD did a masterful job in saving a lot of heartache out there, a lot of hardship out there, and that's a credit to the leadership of the organization, and I commend the Secretary and everybody on down. I'll come to you, Mr. Dennis, here in just a minute, but how long could this successful handling of a kind of a crisis situation actually have gone before we start seeing the ill effects of a shutdown that I'm quite surprised maybe didn't happen?
Well, obviously, during a shutdown, you can't obligate funds you don't have. We don't want to obviously get over the line of the Anti-Deficiency Act. If the question is, when would we have reached a state of where things would have gotten a little out of control. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Congressman, but is that your question? Where?
I think that's about the right way to put it, yes.
Okay. March 1, things would have gotten much more difficult.
What have you been doing since we reopened the government, knowing that we have another cliff that we could possibly step off into, to continue the professional work and the activity that involves so many moving parts during the day? You mentioned you got 23,000 contracts that you're dealing with. I did a little quick Arkansas math. That's about 100 a day that you're dealing with, maybe more, maybe less on given days. So what have you been doing to prepare for what could happen if an agreement were not to be reached by the end of the week?
So we find ourselves in a unique period. We just worked through the longest shutdown in government history. We came out of that for 21 days. We're spending that period to get caught up from the shutdown, to conduct regular business that we would during a 21-day period, and also try to prepare for the next shutdown, which may or may not happen, and if it does, could be of unknown length. So it's been an extremely busy, 50, 60 days now, whatever, since the last shutdown. And we are moving heaven and earth, staff working overtime to get all these contracts fully executed and get the funds obligated. I can assure you, we are moving every possible way to try to get this complicated and antiquated issue, whether resolved, not knowing what's going to happen Friday.
Quick question about modernization, because that's a subject for more advanced discussion, short of having to talk about government shutdowns. What would modernization do from the IT perspective that would allow you a better not that we ever want to be experts at handling a government shutdown, because we don't like those and shouldn't have to go through those, but what would modernization do, for example, in the past shutdown, that would have made life a little easier for you and the people you represent?
That is an easy question, sir. Thank you. Knowing the status of the contracts at any moment in time, knowing where they are and where they are in the process, would greatly improve our situation any day of the week, with or without a shutdown. And we did not have that capability and still do not have it. The system that we use is early 90s technology. It's called TRAX, and while it performs okay, it's almost 30-year technology.
Mr. Dennis, quickly a question for you. 36-year distinguished career at Ernst. Tell me your frustration in dealing with you have to have some frustration, do you not?
I've actually very much enjoyed this last year. We have retirement at our firm at an early age, and I wanted to do public service and give back. So I have not been frustrated. I actually have enjoyed it. But there are differences, and I would say the two key differences when people ask me this question is when you want to get something done and progress and modernize, I do not have control of resources. I can't control people like you want to control in the private sector, and I don't control funds like you do in the private sector. And I will tell you that probably the biggest frustration that we have at HUD is the technology. When you look at our technology, I had our team put together a matrix of all the systems and how they interface. It's old, it's antiquated, it's clumsy, it doesn't interface well, it's hard to move information from point A to point B. Sometimes it's a manual process, sometimes it's on an Excel spreadsheet, very dated stuff. And the number one thing we need is to improve that technology. It would help with everything that the Acting Deputy Secretary just talked about, and that's just in that program. We could eliminate a lot of overtime. And I think generally when I look at HUD per se, I look at the infrastructure and I look at the operations, and our operations are now starting to take over our infrastructure. And when you look at the number of employees 30 years ago, we were close to 16,000, 17,000. Today we're around 7,000. You look at the funds that went through the operations 30 or 35 years ago, it was about $5 or $7, $8 billion. Today we're over 50. So we've got the same infrastructure of technology doing the much more complicated stuff with half the people. So to me, it's a very mildly risky environment, and I think the way that the team pulled together and did what we needed to do in this CR was a yeoman's effort on everyone's part.
Really appreciate the work, Mr. Chairman. I know my time has way since expired. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am too new to this subcommittee. I don't expect you to have a crystal ball to, try to figure out what the White House is going to do and when the next shutdown is going to come, if and when. Nobody here wants to see that, obviously. I think you've heard that from both sides of the aisle here. But we do expect you to do the best under the circumstance. I'm looking forward to reading your proposal on new technology, since you are operating under a 30-year-old TRAX program. I can understand how frustrating that must be for, not only for you, but for your employees. On the issue of employees, your guidance states that, you are to determine, who is going to come to work based on health and safety issues that may come across that employee. So how did you determine, when it comes to housing issues, who is a priority to come to work? Who would be exempted?
Well, there's a contingency plan that was in place at HUD. It was used during the previous administration, and that was the basis of what we use this time.
So you haven't updated that?
Well, we have updated it now.
Okay.
We have what we're calling version 2.0, lessons learned from the last 34 days, so we've made a fair number of revisions.
Is
to
that available
plan.
for us to review?
It absolutely will be available as soon as it's finalized.
And when I look at domestic violence shelters, which is a former 911 dispatcher, I'm very keen to the needs of shelters and ensuring that they have funding available for domestic violence victims to be relocated and moved away from their abusers, not just the female or male victim, but also the children involved in that family unit. Were those employees that work that program required to come to work?
So as I understand, NOFA's Notice of Funding Availabilities, those are not permitted activities because they require the allocation of funds during a government shutdown.
So that's not a public safety issue?
What absolutely is, we still have to have the funding. What we did do, though, is we did recall staff to come in and be prepared to announce those grants as soon as the shutdown ended,
Okay,
which we
so-
did the day after it ended.
Can you walk me through the question on advance appropriation funding? Because I don't think that I'm clear on your answer. You had this funding available, but you spent it very early on in the fiscal year. You say that you need that for bridge funding. So how is the bridge funding made up later on? And did you have any CR funds go unused?
So the advanced funds are used, as you say, and as we discussed earlier, early in the year, to bridges from one fiscal year to the next. My understanding, those advanced funds are not made up during that calendar year. They're not made up with subsequent CRs. They are used and then not available.
So they're really not bridge funding. I mean, if you were utilizing it as part of your budget, why is not just part of your budget?
It's the way the money is appropriated to us.
So is that a recommendation to change? Because if you're holding, landlords accountable for having a reserve, where's your responsibility for a reserve?
I think you're bringing up a good point, that it would be very helpful through the appropriation process if we had a little more flexibility within the funding side. We have some flexibility in the S&E, but on the program side, we do not. And once the funds appropriated for that particular program, it is there. Once the money's appropriated, there's not a lot of flexibility to move around once we run into these situations. And we would, we've had some conversations with your committee staff on the S&E funds for creating a little more flexibility as we go forward. And we hope that our financial controls, or we can prove to you that we're improving our financial controls.
In the last 3 seconds, did you have any CR funds go unused, yes or no?
We had, the answer is yes, but it wasn't a full month's worth of appropriations for these programs.
Okay, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dennis, you're the Chief Financial Officer. Can you tell me, under your rental assistance program, you have about 3,200 public housing authorities that receive payments. You have 2,300 contracts that we've talked about that are all expiring, every day. Of those public housing authorities, how many of those did not receive payment during this time?
January and February, I think 0. I think most of them, everyone received payments.
And yes, sir, just to split hairs, the public housing authorities are different than the 23,000
3,000,
contracts.
okay. So that's in addition to the 23,000?
Yes, and those were paid up through February, the public housing authorities.
And then all 23,000 contracts, of those, can you tell me how many did not get paid?
Well, there's 18,000 that are project-based, 5,000 that are prac renewals. We advance paid 21,500 of them out of the 23,000 roughly. And there were some that are what we call suspension. This happens all the time, nothing to do with a shutdown.
Right.
So the 1175, when you boil the number down, that's the amount that I referenced earlier that.
Yeah.
that
And
we're on a
so
glide
those
path.
people that are doing business with you, no one was harmed financially. Is that,
Well, I would hope not. I mean, again, it's difficult on owners, certainly on tenants. I don't think they would want to go through this again.
Right. no, I understand that. Nobody wants to go through this again. What about the Federal Housing Administration mortgages? Were any of those delayed or refused because of this shutdown?
Well, thankfully, we were able to continue to process, because lenders do a good bit of that, the FHA forward mortgages. The reverse mortgages, however, ran out of commitment authority, so we could not process or endorse any reverse mortgages. So we're getting caught up on those as well.
And all of the CDBG money for Puerto Rico that was obligated, that was all accessible and ready for them as well, right?
Well, we were, on the 1.5 billion, we were still working through, since those funds have been allocated, through the grant agreement. That has been finalized, as I mentioned before. Puerto Rico drew down the first amount Friday evening, $45,000 out of the 1.5 billion.
Right. So all of the angst that we heard in the media about the catastrophic hit that was about to take place in HUD, can you tell me how many tenants were actually evicted during that time?
Sir, we are told that none were evicted as a result of the shutdown.
Right.
But I do want to say, just a lesson learned here, that there could absolutely be better communication between all parties. And there was no intent on our part to not better communicate, but getting those contracts resolved was our highest priority. So we will endeavor to improve communications with or without a shutdown.
Right. And most during your normal business processes, you have these lapses in the contracts all the time. Is that correct?
That's correct. So contracts renew every day, and we typically use a good bit of the next month to get caught up from the previous, because they come in all the way to the end of the month. It is an ongoing, everyday process.
Okay, so, and now, as of now, the 1,175 contracts that had expired through January, those are all back in place, correct?
Well, sir, the category they're in right now is authorized for renewal, which happened this morning. About half of those still require the actual signatures, but as I mentioned before, we're going to accept PDF signatures, which we're told are permitted.
Okay.
So
And-
we're working to get all those done by midnight, just.
But even with
in
those,
case.
nobody missed a payment, and nobody was put on the street. Not a single man, woman, or child was put on the street because of this.
We're not aware of any of that happened as a result of the shutdown relative to the contract issues. I don't want to say we all worked hard to make sure that didn't happen. We were focused on that every day, that we were working through this.
I think as you said, and I'll close with this, I think as you said, that 3 to 5% of your personnel, they did move heaven and earth. So thank you all.
Well, and by and large, that was career staff. Some of them are here with us today. They deserve the vast majority of that credit, and Irv's team in particular.
Thank you. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nice to be back with the subcommittee. Welcome to our new members, and of course, all our thoughts are with Mike Quigley as he goes through this sad time. Thank you for being here. I sort of want to go back to the line of questions that my colleague, Congresswoman Torres, started. It's my understanding that HUD's contingency plan for shutdowns, a lapse in appropriation, calls for HUD to continue performance functions that are necessary to prevent an imminent threat to the safety of human life. Is that correct?
That's correct, but there still has to be funding allocated for us to do that. Otherwise, we might find ourselves in an Anti-Deficiency Act violation.
So is it not really correct in a shutdown? Is that, like, how do you make those decisions? If that's your contingency plan, then it's also subject to funding levels when it involves safety of human life?
It's my understanding, again, to be able, we still have to have the funds to be permitted to be used, which is one reason why there are reserve funds that we require some. If it has FHA insurance on 202s and 811s, they have those funds for situations like this when they have to access those reserve accounts.
So is it your testimony that you have 3% of the workers who are still working, not furloughed, because they're there because of an imminent threat to human life, and then, but somehow domestic violence does not get covered? And is that decision, how was that decision made to eliminate that from the category that is in your own contingency plan?
I don't know that we eliminated it. The issue, as I understand it, and I'm happy to research this more when this is over, that we didn't have the funds to allocate just yet. However, we knew we would at some point, so that we could be ready when the shutdown ended. That's the staff that we were called to work on the continuum of care NOFA grants, to be prepared to announce them when the shutdown ended, which we did the day after the shutdown ended. And then we announced another one a week or so later, another NOFA grant.
So were there any other situations where a real safety to human life is threatened where you would have said, well, we have to wait until after the shutdown? Or was it only domestic violence that fell into that category of not having the funding?
Sure.
Because it's an emergency, sort of the essence of it is we realize you're in a shutdown and don't have access to regular funding. But this is an emergency situation.
Absolutely. So many of these nonprofits and organizations get money from us every year. So they, by and large, would have funds from the previous year. Again, this would have been access to future funds, again, which we announced, the day after the shutdown ended.
Isn't that the emergency nature of that exception in the shutdown about protecting human life? I don't understand why domestic violence decided to get pushed out of that emergency planning.
Well, it's not that we pushed it out of the emergency planning. I just can't allocate funds that I don't have. And again, we wanted to be ready to go when it ended, and we did it the next day. I totally understand where you're coming from, but again, I can't allocate funds that I don't have.
That's why we have contingency plans when human life is at stake, as it was for many cases, cases that we have heard of. Another thing that we heard of was that domestic violence shelters attempting to secure HUD funding were locked out of the system. But that, again, is part of your contingency plan that specifically says they will be able, in a shutdown, to access homeless assistant grants. So why were they not able to access that?
So some of those groups that we heard from had password issues. Some of them had other issues just accessing the system. A lot of that is done through field office staff that was furloughed. So working with our CIO in headquarters, when we heard about this, we developed a workaround solution that allowed us to work through those problems from headquarters. So again, when we heard about them, we acted, we created a solution, and as I'm told, eliminated those problems, the few that had problems accessing the system.
Do you think when we see your report on lessons learned, is that protecting people whose lives are at risk because of domestic violence will be back at the top of needing protection in the very unfortunate event that we ever go through another government shutdown?
Well, they are absolutely a priority for HUD, I can assure you, every day of the week.
Well, it seems like if they're supposed to get funding in an emergency when life is threatened, and yet you say they weren't able to access that because there wasn't funding, that there is a breakdown in the system and how we're addressing these very real needs of the people in this situation in HUD properties.
It's a convergence, obviously, of a CR, one funding cycle ending, another one beginning, and what we are permitted to do during a shutdown.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hurd?
Thank you, Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Have all of your employees, especially the 3 to 5% that worked their tails off to make sure everybody was protected, been made whole with their pay?
Well, the good news, all of them were paid by the 31st. That was the last pay period in the previous calendar year and the first one this calendar year. We are absolutely working through ways that we can show our gratitude for the staff that work without pay for 34 days.
Leave, pay, any
Any
issue
combination.
with healthcare, all of that has been sorted out.
It's my understanding, yes, but again, to show the gratitude for the staff that did that, we're working through ways that we can show that gratitude in ways that they would appreciate.
A good copy. We talked about the manual processing of the tracks system. Had this not been a manual process, the difficulty on the 3 to 5% that were running the show, it would have been a lot easier for them to understand where contracts were. Is that correct to understand that?
It could have been nearly instantaneous to
And-
track those contracts.
And who is responsible within HUD on the automating the track system? Who has operational control of that project?
By the way, I would say to my previous answer, assuming we had the funding, obviously.
Well, it's a joint effort between, a collaborative effort between all the programs, the CIO, CFO, and one of the things that I did when I came up.
I heard what I wanted to hear, the CIO's role, all right? And Mr. Dennis, you said that there is no flexibility on the program side. Would you not consider the MGT Act that this Congress passed last year? It's a piece of legislation from a dashing young congressman from Texas that was supported by this committee. Would that not be considered flexibility within the program side?
I'm going to have to, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not familiar with the
MGT was designed to have working capital. If you modernize your infrastructure, your IT infrastructure, the money that you save could be put into a working capital fund. And I see on your FRTARA scorecard, which you went from a D in November 2015 to a C plus in December, that you only got a C on MGT, which means you had plans on creating an MGT fund, but you hadn't.
Yeah, so thank you for clarifying the working capital fund. That is an area that we may be able to create some flexibility. One of the things we're doing in the IT fund is really geared towards maintenance. And to the extent there are funds that roll over from one year to the next, we're hopeful that we can go through a reprogramming exercise and develop.
The answer is not may, it can, and that's why it was designed to do that. And I see on your software licensing on MGT, on your FRTARA scorecard is an F, meaning you do not know all the programs that are being used on your system. Now, Mr. Montgomery, you've been on the job for less than a month, is that correct?
Well, I've been FHA Commissioner since June of 2018.
Okay.
I took over as Acting Deputy Secretary a week before the shutdown ended.
Gotcha. Other agencies have saved billions of dollars on understanding their software licensing, which could then go into the MGT fund, which could then be used as rollover funds to work on the track system. So I would be interested in your plans on how you plan to get a control over the software licensing, because that can drive modernization in so much of your program, as well as how you plan to use MGT for the modernization of the tracks system.
Thank you. We will absolutely take a look at that and come back to you with our thoughts. But, I have spent time with your team talking about our finance transformation plan, which includes IT modernization, and we're working very closely with our CIO and admin and the programs to make that a holistic approach. It's, it can't be understated or overstated how antiquated these IT systems are. So any ideas you have to allocate money and help us find money would much appreciated.
Well, you've taken the first step in empowering your CIO, making sure that person reports directly to Mr. Montgomery, and actually having a permanent CIO. Many other agencies haven't even taken these basic steps in order to modernize that enterprise, and it's going to increase efficiencies, which I'm glad we've talked almost to everybody's question. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be back in this subcommittee. I still remain the low person on the totem pole, so we've got to figure out how that worked. And just nice to follow the dashing young man from Texas walking through procurement and IT with us. Mr. Dennis, I wanted to ask you about Puerto Rico. Can you clarify your position on CDBG disaster funding? HUD's contingency plan for the shutdown, as we've discussed, but it specifically mentioned appropriating in the fiscal year 18 to be dispersed during the shutdown. HUD delayed the disbursement of the funds to Puerto Rico because the agency has required additional documents outlining how Puerto Rico will spend the disaster funding. On February 9th, HUD published a notice stating the agency will take 60 days instead of 40 days it would normally take to review Puerto Rico's application. So my question is, what's the delay? Shouldn't we be working to review this more quickly and disperse these funds?
You want me to, that's probably more my area, sir. So the 1.5 billion I referenced earlier, we were able to work on that action plan, and those funds Puerto Rico was able to draw down on February the 4th. This is the 1.5 billion. And they did make the first draw Friday evening of $45,000. The 8.2 billion, and this is all unmet need category, that's this tranche of money, I believe, sir, that you're probably referring to. We will be putting out a notice shortly regarding that action plan. We discussed this with Governor Rosselló when he was in last week. We communicate with his staff regularly, and we're hopeful then to get that action plan finalized and get the grant agreement signed. And we've been communicating this with his staff as recently as Friday.
I appreciate that you're having those discussions with them. What are the delays?
Well, sir, I'm not sure that there's a delay right now. Again, we want to, and it's not just Puerto Rico. I know your question's directed at that. There's obviously California, Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, and other states in there. We've made the first tranche of unmet need a priority, and which is why we did the 1.5 billion first. Puerto Rico, along with other states, we're reviewing their action plans as we speak, and hopefully getting closer to a solution on those as well.
How would you describe their action plan and compared to the other cities or other states that you mentioned, Georgia, California?
Well, certainly the damage was more profound in Puerto Rico, no doubt about that. Texas, Florida, and Georgia had significant damage, as did some communities in California. But there's no doubt Puerto Rico's was significant. The damage was devastating.
I guess my comments would be, I appreciate the clarification. My comment would be, these individuals, when we speak with them, they know that members of Congress advocate, and that's what we all do. They don't feel that they have the ear of folks here. They feel like they've been left behind, that they're U.S. citizens, but they aren't receiving the funds and the care and the advocacy, quite honestly, that other individuals, other communities receive. So I'd just like to ask that you be sensitive to that. We don't need to treat them any differently. Let's move on these action plans, and let's give them the help that they need so those communities can rebuild, just like Georgia, Texas, Florida, California, the states that you mentioned.
And I'll absolutely commit to doing that better, sir, where I haven't. So I'll
I appreciate
be
it.
very mindful of that going forward.
I appreciate it, sir. Mr. Montgomery, again for you, the FHA handbook, mortgages can be made to non-permanent residents if the application is authorized to work, if the applicant, I'm sorry, is authorized to work in the U.S. and has a history of status renewals. As you might know, deferred action for childhood arrivals, the DACA program allows some undocumented immigrants to work in the United States. In many cases, DACA recipients have renewed their status at least once, if not multiple times. These hardworking young men and women pay taxes and have undergone vetting process to participate in the DACA program. In December, an article was published that revealed HUD was advised lenders to stop lending to FHA-backed loans to DACA recipients. According to the article, HUD shared this information with lenders over the phone and at conferences. However, the agency has not put out any policy in writing. There are 700,000 DACA recipients living in the United States who, I said, pay taxes and contribute to our economy. Many want to become homeowners, and more are working to attain that goal in the future. To your knowledge, has HUD issued any type of policy surrounding DACA recipients' eligibility for FHA-backed home loans?
Sir, I can tell you, at my level, I'm also the FHA commissioner. The policy has been unchanged for many years. The current policy was developed in 2003, and then it was codified into the new FHA handbook in 2015, then the previous administration. That policy is exactly what we're following today, sir.
So it would surprise you if HUD staff or individuals were advising lenders of that, not to work with DACA recipients?
I'm not aware of, I've heard some accusations of that, sir. It hasn't come from me. But again, I can't speak for all my staff, but I do know we haven't changed that policy dating back 15 years or so.
Okay. Well, we can make sure that you have that article as well that goes into some specifics, but I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
sir.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Well, gentlemen, let me return to the subject with which we started, namely the contract expirations and the way in which that they were handled, and the kind of conclusions you've drawn looking back on this as to how this went and how the process might be improved in the future. As I understand it, as we said initially, there was a failure to renew some 1,150 contracts that came to light about 2 weeks into the shutdown in early January, and those contracts were about half December contracts, half January contracts, and the question is, were those expirations appropriately anticipated and dealt with in the best possible way? Mr. Montgomery, I appreciate your comments about communication. We do, of course, need to pay attention to that, and I appreciate your acknowledgement of that. In looking over this episode, we don't find much about this in the shutdown plans that HUD developed. In fact, the level of detail is much less than we've seen from other agencies. And then, as others have raised, there are questions, I think, that maybe we could nail down a little further about sources of funding that might have been used had they been available to deal with this situation into the shutdown. For example, the advance funding, the advance appropriations. In retrospect, might that have been handled differently, and might that have been available to bridge some of these gaps had that not been spent, those $400 million not been spent earlier? And then the question was raised about the CR funds. The CR funds, of course, had expired on the 21st. We understand that something like $1 billion of those funds, $1 billion of those funds, were allowed to expire. Might that have been applied to some of these contract renewals at an earlier point? So you see what concerns us here. We of course are grateful that worse consequences didn't materialize, but it was a fairly close call, and there been plenty of alarm bells going off about what this might look like in the future. So you see what we're looking for here, and as you're looking toward the future and whether some of this might be corrected, we'd like to have your reflections on that. We all need to understand it going forward.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman, and while I hope we never go through one again, it was certainly a learning process for all of us, and we've carefully documented, we've carefully updated our contingency plan as we see fit. And, you know, again, these happen so infrequently, it's hard to gauge, first off, if they're actually going to happen until they happen, and then secondly, when they do happen, how long are they going to last? You know, the last one in 2013 was a matter of days. I think you have to go back to 95, 96 to find one that lasted as long as this one. So our principal driving and guiding principle, sir, was we didn't want people to suffer as a result of this. So there were different between reserve accounts, replacement for reserve accounts, some either with the owner, some with HUD, through other funds, sources of funds, a housing certificate. We had the funds to get those contracts renewed, the 1175 for December and January.
Yeah, well, yes, but you were scrambling. You were piecing together funds from various sources, and I asked you about two particular sources of funds that weren't available for you for the reasons I stated. What's your retrospective assessment of that?
So on the 400 million, again, as with the technology limitations we have and the gap between fiscal years, we literally, and this began a number of years ago, have to shut down the system. It's that, and for 2.5 weeks to change over, it's that 400 million that's used every year to do that. So I don't know specifically when those funds were gone, but they were long gone, I'm told, before the shutdown happened.
The other thing I would add is, you're right, there's some of that money from the CR was there. It wasn't quite a full month. And we are looking at it would require a change of a business process to get those allocated quicker, and also a different technology. It's a very decentralized process. It requires coordination and communication with the landlords and our folks. It's not centrally controlled out of headquarters. But as we learned and as we go through finance transformation, IT modernization, we'll take a look and see if there's a more efficient and a quicker way to allocate those funds. But I would say in the 2 weeks that we had, or even in anticipation before, which is your question, it's very difficult to do that when in a CR environment with our systems and our processes the way they are.
Well, I appreciate that, and we'll await the results of those considerations. We have asked, our staff has asked that you provide more detail in future shutdown plans to address contract renewals. It really was not sufficiently detailed. Whatever your judgment about the kind of steps you took to meet these needs.
And
we
I
need
will
to articulate
apologize for
need to
that.
articulate much more precisely what kind of
Absolutely.
activities will and will not be
Absolutely.
performed.
Yes, sir, we absolutely will, and I'll apologize for that miscommunication and lack of it.
And this is a question of planning also, and,
Yes,
and
sir.
making quite explicit what is going to be done in various contingencies.
Absolutely, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Yesblart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Actually, Mr. Aguilar just reminded me, speaking about CDBG-EDR, one of the things that I'm really proud of is that I worked with the chairman to provide funding not only for recovery, but also for mitigation, long-term mitigation. And just just, I don't expect you to have the answer to this one now, but if I could just throw it your way, so obviously our states are waiting anxiously for Federal Register notification for the disaster mitigation program. And if you could, again, I don't expect you to have that now, but if you get back to me about the status of the notifications of the CDBG-DR mitigation funds when you can, it'd be helpful.
And I'm happy to do that now, or
Oh,
we
wow,
can
okay.
do it afterward, whatever.
Well, I mean, if you have, you don't need to give it to me now, but, so let me go to other questions, but I would love
Sure,
to,
absolutely,
love if you
sir.
can get that to me. Mr. Dennis, let me, obviously, the issue about, if you can give me some more details about how you work to find the available funds to renew the contracts. Because, which accounts did you scrub? Which programs presented the greatest challenges as you work to find the available funds to renew these contracts? And also, you mentioned about the issue of, the Anti-Deficiency Act violations. How were you able to ensure that you weren't running into that?
So the first part of your question as it relates to the funds, I would say we did a relatively normal process only on an accelerated basis. We did scrub prior year funding that was available. That's an exercise we go through every once in a while. We did that during the 2 weeks and before. So we accelerated what I would call a normal process. That money's carried over from prior years and we're able to use it, we did. PBRA was probably a little more challenging, but all programs have their challenges. PBRA probably just because of the decentralized nature of it and the process, the manual, and having to reach out to the landlords on the other side of the contract. Anti-deficiency is, again, 37 years in public accounting. I understand controls. I'm passionate about them, and we have the appropriate law staff is within the CFO shop at HUD, as you know. We work very closely with the programs. Anytime we want to make a modification to a contingency plan or do something different with funds, we go through that process. I love his precision. He's very precise. He's good. And if there's, on the contingency plan, once we go through the process internally between the program lawyers, the LS lawyers, and then GCO, obviously it goes through O&B review as well at that point. So we were very conscious of that, making sure that we did not have any ADA violations or tried not to.
Well, I appreciate that. And, every member of this subcommittee, frankly, every member of the Appropriations Committee hates CRs and obviously shutdowns. And I think one of the issues that we've had, there's so many new people in Congress, is try to explain to folks just how damaging the CRs are, not only shutdowns, but CRs are. And so I think you've all kind of hit on that today, which I think is important for, frankly, other members to hear as well. But again, you just talked about, Mr. Dennis, you've had extensive private sector experience. So, tell me a little bit about some of the lessons learned from this experience, which is unique, obviously, and, are there some process improvements that HUD could make when it comes to, project-based contracts? And just kind of an open-ended question, but again, your experience, I want to tap into that.
Yeah, so I constantly get asked the question, observe the difference between private and public sector, and I don't want to, I've been through and have led a lot of crisis management through my 37 years, and I don't want to put this in a category of crisis, although some may suggest 3% of your workforce doing critical duty could be in that category. And what I observed through this 2-week CR was great management by a great leadership team. You need calmness, which happened. You need coordination amongst all of the leadership, which happened, and you needed great communication within HUD. And I appreciate, we maybe a little bit better communication with you folks, and we can talk about that. But I thought the team did a great job getting through it. The lessons learned from HUD specifically is, again, just not so much learned, but just another indication and awareness that our IT systems need to be improved. We did learn some from process stuff that we may be able to take a look back at future potential CRs. I think we learned that if we had a little more flexibility in how we could maybe use some of the program money, that would have been helpful to us. I think there's lessons learned that we can certainly share with you and maybe work together to get some of the flexibility that would help us do our jobs better and more efficient.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Watson Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to have some clarification on a line of questioning that Congresswoman Clark endeavored upon. And it has to do with accepting employees, including those who are performing emergency work involving the safety of human life or the protection of property or performing certain other types of accepted work. How do you determine who that is? And what functions are they doing that constitute health and safety under your definition?
So again, those plans are developed and used frequently. And, you know, it's a constant flow of program dollars between when NOFA grants are made, when old funding runs out, when new funding is made. In terms of what actually is used for health and safety, again, it's not like there's a moment in time where that organization will run out of money, in this case in January.
Okay, I think my question is more like, what types of programs are covered under that? For instance, my colleague presented for your consideration homelessness programs, especially in the dead of winter, and domestic violence programs involving protecting women and their children, moving them, paying for things that are actually life safety, taking them out of very violent situations. Do those not constitute accepted employee functioning under this definition?
Well, you know, again, this was for a new notice of funding availability going from that point forward. We fund these organizations every year, whether it's domestic violence, homeless shelters, you name it.
I'm sorry, Mr. Montgomery, you're confusing me. I just want to know, do those functions, those kinds of programs, particularly sheltering the homelessness especially in bad weather like we've had, and domestic violence programs, do those people working to ensure that those programs are running, do they fall into that category? That's a yes or a no.
Well, some staff are permitted to work on preparing those NOFAs, but again, Congresswoman, I can't make an announcement for funding I do not have. I think that's the core issue here.
I'm sorry, that's really another good point. This seems to be directed at an emergency situation, the health and safety of somebody or some building or whatever is in peril, in proximity. What does that mean? You got to have funding.
Well, the Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits me or any government employee from obligating funds they do not have. And if I don't have the funds for the NOFA, then I can't announce the notice of those funds being available.
Did you say NOFO?
I'm sorry, ma'am, notice of funding availability, NOFA.
So should there be a fund available for such situations, since they're not anticipated, they just occur? How do you deal with that?
Well, that's probably a question, probably more within this body, but we're certainly open to having those discussions with you. Again, we receive the funds as they're allocated.
But you ask for what you need too.
Yes, well, we get those funds every year, and Congress gives them to us.
But you don't have
But-
any such things as emergency funds for that purpose per se, right?
I'm not aware of any emergency funds under that program. Congresswoman, I'd be happy to look into that, though.
Thank you, Mr. Montgomery.
Thank
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Rutherford?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Montgomery, I think what might be a little confusing here, the Domestic Violence in Housing and Technical Assistance Initiative that the money is provided for, $2.3 million at one time, is to actually work with 4 different organizations: the District Alliance for Safe Housing in Washington, D.C., the National Network to End Domestic Violence in Washington, D.C., the National Resource Center for Domestic Violence in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and the Training Development Associates from Laurinburg, North Carolina, and / Collaborative Solutions in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, those 4 grant recipients of this domestic violence program, they're actually working to develop policy, how to improve a policy, how to ID promising practices around the country, sort of a best practice initiative, and strengthening collaboration with community stakeholders. This is a planning function, correct? This is not someone who's like the police or providing protection to a domestic violence victim. Is that correct?
Congressman, I'd have to look into that. I've been in the acting deputy secretary role for just about 3 weeks, and so if I could get back to you on that question, I'd be happy
let me
to.
know, because I'm sitting here a little confused myself. Are you actually, is HUD actually entering into agreements where they're taking on the responsibility of protecting domestic violence individuals, or are they developing policies where they will collaborate with the stakeholders in the community, like police and others who are, domestic violence shelters and those kind of things? Yeah, let me know, because
Yes, I will, Congressman.
my understanding, it looks more like a planning process than, where I'm responding to the scene of a domestic violence call.
I'd be happy to look into that, sir, but I don't know the exact specific answer to your question.
Yeah.
We
planning for-
will look into this and get back to the
Yeah.
committee
Yeah,
with
let
the
me
exact
know.
answer.
Thank you.
I apologize, that just came under my purview a few weeks ago, so.
That's fine. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres?
We fund shelters. We fund emergency housing programs. My initial question was about the shelters that we fund for domestic violence victims. Within those shelters, they have programs, housing programs. Sometimes they have to get an emergency voucher to get them from their abuser into a new location. Sometimes they have to pay utility bills. So those programs is what I was referring to. They were at risk. There's no place to send a victim of a domestic violence if they don't have the funding. Should they have a mechanism of reserves? Maybe. But remember that shelters depend on the federal government for 80% of their funding. 80%. So there are no reserves, sir. You are the reserve. And when we choose to shut down and refuse entry to workers that specifically work to fund those programs, people's lives are at risk. Now, I want you to look forward, and I want to figure out how we can fix this. I pray to God that, this president would not shut down the government once again. But who knows what he will do if he doesn't get his way. But the grown-ups in the room here have to figure out how we're going to deal with victims and how we're going to house people that have severe disabilities and prevent them from being evicted. So you say, so far you've heard of no evictions. I say, I have heard from my housing authorities in the district that I represent, and the confidence that landlords no longer have in the federal government is a cost of doing business. and not just the cost of doing business. It's a cost of protecting a victim of violence. Now, that's not on you. That's on President Trump. Shut down. I'm not saying that is on you. What is on you is a policy that I hope to get real soon on how we can be better at this. And as the First Lady would say, we need to be best. So I yield back.
And I will absolutely commit to working with you, Congresswoman, in this committee on how we can avoid this, should there be any future shutdowns. So thank you.
Mr. Hurd.
Thanks again, Mr. Chairman. The San Antonio Housing Authority provides assistance to about 65,000 people. Half of those are kids under 18. How did HUD ensure that the vulnerable families that need a HUD voucher was able to get that to make their rent payment?
So as I mentioned previously, the Public and Indian Housing Program, separate from the PBRA that I run, they were paid up through February. All those public and housing authorities were paid up through February.
So if
That's the Housing Choice Vouchers, that
and
program.
going into speaking like my friend Ms. Torres was talking about, looking forward, if the government were to shut down this weekend, how does it impact those people that need those payments
They would be paid up through April.
because of the
Funding that we
funding
got
of
during the CR we're in right now.
Good copy. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just going back again to this domestic violence issue, there are emergency transfers for Section 8 and homelessness assistance grants. I understand that funding was out, very difficult for people to access. Maybe the people were furloughed who could help with the passwords, et cetera. What we have heard reports of is because they were blocked and these were true emergencies, some domestic violence organizations actually took out loans to provide the money to find alternative housing. Is there a plan in HUD to reimburse those organizations for those costs?
Yes, it is my understanding they will absolutely be reimbursed.
That's great, thank you. Back to your testimony that there are 0 evictions, and I understand you're putting some qualifiers around that, but to the best of your knowledge, there are 0 evictions. But there are definitely reports that while not technically an eviction, we do have landlords who are not renewing Section 8 housing leases because of the experience of the shutdown. So while different, the practical effect is the same. Tenants are forced to leave their housing. Do you have a count of how many situations that has happened with? How many landlords have decided not to renew because of the shutdown?
Congresswoman, we don't have those, but I would say that with or without a government shutdown, it is always a problem regarding preservation and owners that want to opt out for reasons, increased property value. So preservation, with or without a shutdown, is always a problem that we confront.
It is, but I think you can agree the shutdown definitely accelerated that in certain cases. And are you trying
I
to get
wouldn't
a
disagree.
handle of how many that may be? Are you just don't have that information yet, or are you not counting?
We don't have the information yet because we're using this 3-week period to get caught up from the last one, get the funds allocated today, and prepare for another one. But we've certainly had discussions about this topic.
Yeah. Speaking of that, having met with HUD employees in my home state of Massachusetts and having dealt with the many talented people who devote their careers to public service, I'm struck, Mr. Dennis, by you coming into public service after a career in private sector and your comments on the dire staffing needs of HUD. And I know from speaking to employees in my district that they are concerned that what was a problem before the shutdown is now accelerated. We can't have a month-long furlough with all the grants and other deadlines that people need to make to get the housing needs met in our communities without having a ripple effect across the system. So can you tell me in the administration's budget what staffing level increases you are requesting to meet these very real needs?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but we can certainly get them for you, and we are very focused on getting the right headcount in our at HUD.
Okay, great.
But I'll be happy to supply that information to you.
We will look forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me turn to CDBG DR funding, two very different, but I think quite pertinent questions that I'd like to raise as we enter our final round of questioning here. Mr. Montgomery, I'll address this to you. In your testimony, you used the rather striking phrase, move heaven and earth, in the case of Puerto Rico. I certainly hope that's true and appreciate your emphasizing that that's exactly the approach that needs to be taken in that very dire situation. Now, we've heard lately in the press that the White House, and in particular the OMB director, Mick Mulvaney, former OMB director, that they're considering siphoning money away from Puerto Rico recovery efforts to help fund border wall construction. That clearly would circumvent the will of the Congress and probably violates both appropriations law and the separation of powers. But I wonder what your view of that would be. Does HUD have the authority to divert funding from grantees that have received CDBG-DR allocations? And have you or anyone else at HUD that you know of had conversations with the White House or OMB about redirecting funding from Puerto Rico, California, other grantees to the President's Wall project?
Discussions that we have obviously with White House staff, we typically can keep private, but I would say there's no discussion about siphoning money away from disaster recovery, and it's my understanding that would require Congress to do that. So there's been no discussion of that topic, sir.
And your understanding is that that would be in violation of appropriations law?
It's certainly my understanding, Mr. Chairman, yes.
We share that understanding. Now let me turn to the state action plans and something I hope you can clear up. I'm referring now back to the shutdown contingency plan back in December. And a couple of apparently contradictory items here. Maybe you can respond right off the bat. Maybe you'll need to come back to us. But on page 8, there is a statement to the effect that the Office of Community Planning and Development will continue disaster recovery assistance program funded through multi-year appropriations. That is into a shutdown period. The disaster funding included in the Bipartisan Budget Act is available until expended and contain $10 million for salaries and expenses to administer the CDBG-DR program. But on that same page, the department asserts that the review of consolidated plans or action plans is not an accepted activity. Now, that appears on the face of it to be a direct contradiction. And the department, in fact, did suspend review of CDBG-DR action plans and amendments during the shutdown. So it's not just a hypothetical problem. So given the fact that no year funding has been provided for disaster recovery efforts, and the contingency plan states that HUD would continue these programs, why did you suspend review of the action plans? Why didn't the department use the $10 million provided for salaries and expenses to continue to review plans and plan amendments?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I will give you a brief answer and then commit to responding with a more detailed one. There's several pots of money, as you mentioned. There's no year money. Then there's some staff that are called term staff. I do know this, I understand that we're prohibited from working on any sort of consolidation plans during a shutdown. Funds that have been obligated, for example, with Puerto Rico, we were permitted to work on those funds that we were working to get available and allocated to Puerto Rico. Irv and I, as Senate confirmed appointees, were able to work on that. I apologize again for giving a short answer, but I will commit to getting a more detailed response to you following this hearing.
I appreciate that. That too is possibly an item for future attention, clarification.
Yes, sir, there's various pots of money, some employees treated under different categories, and we will definitely work to clear that up.
So, related to that, when do you plan on announcing the resumption of these plan and plan amendment reviews? What should we anticipate
That
in
is
the near
imminent,
future?
sir, probably within several days.
Several days.
Yes, sir.
All right.
And I can, probably by the end of the week, have a much better idea of the specific day.
And have you communicated that to grantees and other interested parties?
We have constant communication with those states. They do know that something is imminent, but again, sir, I think by the end of the week, we'll have a better idea of the exact day. We're working very hard, again, like a lot of things, to get caught up on that as well.
All right, thank you. Mr. Diaz-Villar?
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief. Actually, I was going to touch on exactly the same issue that you just did about, now, I understand that, time and time again, you've said you can't allocate funds that you don't have. And so I think it's a pretty strong consensus, bipartisan consensus, at least among appropriators, and I think among many, that I don't care what you want to call it, CRs, and you can put names to the CR. Is it this person's CR, or is it the Schumer shutdown or the last long shutdown? The reality is CRs are frankly very detrimental, and shutdowns are beyond that. And so I just hope more people understand that. Clearly, the Appropriations Committee understands that. But my understanding is that the impact communities from the storms were able to draw down funds because the funds were already available. And I'm pleased that I know that Florida, for example, was able to continue to draw on funding allocations for Hurricane Irma and long-term recovery. So I would just also, and I kind of asked about that to you, sir, about the CDBG-DR, the mitigation funds. Do you want to touch, where's that? And again, I didn't think you were going to be ready for that at this
Maybe in my
time,
fourth
but if
week
you
on the
are,
job, but-
right, exactly. There you go. I know, exactly. But again, if you want to touch a little bit on that, and if not, if you can get back to me on that.
Sure,
as I
I'll just
mentioned.
provide a brief update. Our first priority was unmet need. Obviously, HUD's more the long-term, supplemental funding mechanism. We've had discussions with FEMA. They're more the resiliency mitigation experts. And remember, the mitigation funds, this is the first time they've been allocated separately.
Correct.
To be forward-looking, I think that was a great move by Congress.
And now, that was this subcommittee, by the way.
Absolutely, the subcommittee.
It wasn't the Senate, it was this subcommittee, right?
But it's the first time we've done it, and we don't want it to necessarily look like traditionally what HUD does, nor do we want it to look exactly like what FEMA does. So in our discussions with them, sort of a hybrid approach, making sure it does its intended purpose.
Thank you. Look, and Mr. Chairman, let me thank you for, I think this has been a very important hearing, a very fruitful hearing. But I do want to end by thanking you all. And, the folks that were working under very difficult circumstances, weren't getting paid, doing some really important jobs. And again, I would hope that non-appropriators would listen to what we have heard today, and what those of us that kind of have a little bit better understanding as to the potential impacts, not only of the shutdowns, which are obviously disastrous, but even of the CRs that you mentioned time and time again. But again, I just want to thank you. And if you could, just know that, and I think I can speak for everybody, how grateful we are to all of you, but also those folks that you called up who worked awfully hard under very difficult circumstances, not getting paid, and frankly, not knowing when they could get paid. And so again, thank you all for what you do, and hopefully you will not have to ever deal with that circumstance. It's something that none of us should ever have to deal with. But again, Mr. Chairman, thank you for this hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, and let me underscore that we see from our discussion here today the kind of circumstances that we're dealing with. That shutdowns are terrible. CRs are only slightly less so, and the kind of anticipation planning, contingency planning that is required is very demanding, and you shouldn't have to go through this again. And of course, we will do everything in our power to make certain that you don't. I do want to thank you for being here today. I thank you for the preparation that went into this, the participation, your answers. I thank the people behind you, the staff members that back you up, the HUD staff that has been professional and dedicated under a good deal of duress. So we do acknowledge that and thank you for your good work, and we will hopefully now be free to, as you say, wrap up unfinished business, but then look down toward the writing of a new bill and dealing with any kind of challenges that need work, and prepare for to learn from our experiences and chart a positive course going forward. I think we will have a number of questions probably to submit to you for the record, and we will do that within a very short period of time. Please work with OMB to return information for the record, and 30 days is the deadline we ask you to meet, 30 days from Friday. And so then we'll be able to publish the transcript of today's hearing and make informed decision as we look toward 2020. Mr. Asvard, any final comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If not, then we thank you, and this hearing's adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you.
would assume that anyone who's touching it.
Sounds like Connor, part two.
We're doing a lot more outside releases this year.
Hey, George, how you doing? Good, how are you? Good.
That's true. I keep that caveat. Yeah. So.
I was wondering, for example.
So they've done this